This morning's reading comes from Jeremiah chapter 1, verses 4 to 10. These are the words of the prophet Jeremiah. The word of the Lord came to me, saying, Before I formed you in the womb, I knew you. Before you were born, I set you apart. I appointed you as a prophet to the nations. Alas, sovereign Lord, I said, I do not know how to speak. I am too young. But the Lord said to me, Do not say I am too young. You must go to everyone I send you to and say whatever I command you. Do not be afraid of them, for I am with you and will rescue you, declares the Lord. Then the Lord reached out his hand and touched my mouth and said to me, I have put my words in your mouth. See, today I appoint you over nations and kingdoms to uproot and tear down, to destroy and overthrow, to build and to plant. The word of the Lord.
I hope you're all comfortable if I take my mask off up here. I don't think you'd hear me otherwise. Well, firstly, I had a PowerPoint, which has always been compatible before, but today that PowerPoint has refused to work, so I don't have a PowerPoint, so there we are. Well, there are 4 lectionary readings suggested for the message this week, and you may be wondering why I've chosen Jeremiah. In fact, maybe after I started, I wondered why I'd chosen Jeremiah. But I think we all know what it means when someone is being referred to as a Jeremiah. A pessimist about the present and also foresees a disastrous future. Yes, a prophet of doom. And Jeremiah is the longest single book in the Bible. 52 chapters, mostly full of gloom, doom, and judgment. But I found I was very challenged by the verses we read, and also again as I reflected on the life of Jeremiah. Well, I'll go through the reading to begin with. In verses 1 to 2, we discover that Jeremiah is a young man, possibly a teenager, at most 20. And he came from a priestly family, living about 5 kilometres or so out of Jerusalem, around 620 BC. Now, good priests who carried out their duties faithfully and served the people were well liked. They were a mediator between God and the people. They offered sacrifices and represented the needs of them before God. They taught God's laws, and they themselves were holy people. Their role was predictable, one of authority and respect. And Jeremiah would have expected to follow in this priestly role. He was familiar with God's word, was being trained and prepared for this work. His life was mapped out for him. But in verses 4 to 5, something happens that Jeremiah was totally unprepared for. Out of the blue, God spoke to him directly. It was a personal encounter with God. And the message he was given was that God was calling him to be a prophet to the nations. And not just the Jewish nation, but to the neighbouring nations too. Well, a prophet's role is much more demanding than a priest's. You never knew from one day to the next what God would call you to do or to say. Priests work primarily to preserve the past, the traditions of their religion. But prophets work to change the present so that people could have a future. They tried to reach people and change their hearts. And the message was usually one that the people didn't want to hear. And being a prophet was a role that no one really wanted. And Jeremiah's reaction to this direct encounter? Shock, dismay, and possibly panic. This was not good news. And I think our reaction would have been much the same. And then came his excuses. And I'm sure we can all identify with this. We've all made excuses at some time. Our excuses are many and varied. I don't know how. I have an appointment. It's not my area of expertise. I don't understand. I'll start my exercise program tomorrow. I'm too busy today. And as Christians, we make excuses to God. It's the minister's job. It's not my gift. I don't know my Bible well enough. And we can be quite skillful and slick with them. Well, some people are not so good at making excuses. When we lived in another state for a few years, Richard, as part of his work, was a part-time forensic scientist, and he had to testify in court on many occasions. And some were high-profile cases, others were small. On one occasion, he had to go to a small country courthouse. The lawyer, the police, the magistrate, and the accused had arrived and were waiting. But no one had brought the key to open the courthouse door. The accused man then had to pick the lock and proceeded to do so. And when the case started, it then also proceeded to plead not guilty to breaking and entering. And his lawyer had to convince the magistrate that this man was incapable of such a thing, with many excuses. I think he was probably found guilty. But in verse 6, Jeremiah's excuse was no way. He was too young. He didn't know how to speak. He had no authority. Well, this was probably a very reasonable excuse. He was taken by surprise. This was a tremendous challenge, and he probably did doubt his ability. He lacked confidence and the experience. To be God's spokesman to the nations was an overwhelming task about which anyone would feel inadequate. And it's not just young people who make excuses. Moses was an older person, about 80, and when God called him to lead the Israelites out of Egypt, he had the same reaction as Jeremiah. In fact, he made the same excuse. He didn't know how to speak. In fact, he made 5 excuses. The last one being, please send somebody else. So it's possible that as we get older, we get even better at making excuses. Well, maybe Jeremiah had missed the beginning of God's words, but I suspect he just didn't want to hear them. They were so disturbing, and the call was so out of his comfort zone that they left him completely unprepared. In verse 5, God says he'd known all about him, even before he was born, and appointed him to be a prophet to the nations. He'd been set apart and commissioned to serve. There was an important and a distinctive plan for his life. He had to let go of his own plans and fulfill God's. And then we discover that God is not very sympathetic towards Jeremiah. He's not buying any excuses. In fact, he's saying, I'm not asking you, I'm telling you. You don't really have a choice here. How Jeremiah felt was not important. Lack of ability and age were not important. His job was to be obedient. He would do the work not because of who he was. Jeremiah couldn't possibly do this work by himself. But God would qualify him for the task. And it wasn't on the basis of his past training, and certainly not because he had all the right answers or the right words. All that was irrelevant. He was qualified because of who God is. God will make him able. That's his job. God will equip him and give him his power and will be faithful to him. And in verse 8, the next words don't add to Jeremiah's confidence when he's told not to be afraid of them. Well, obviously this was a dangerous task. I think his mind must have been racing. Why would he be afraid? What was going to happen to him? Why will I need rescuing? He was probably quite terrified by now. Plus, there was a price to pay for answering answering God's call. God was going to put words into his mouth so he couldn't help but speak. And the result would be total destruction, to uproot, tear down, destroy, overthrow, later to build and to plant. Well, let's look very briefly at Jeremiah's life after God spoke to him. Jeremiah was the last prophet to Judah, the southern kingdom, and the capital was Jerusalem. He had a troubled life in one of the most troublesome times in Hebrew history, leading up to the fall of Jerusalem in 587 BC. His calling was to pronounce God's judgment on the people because of their sinfulness. His main concern was that they turned away from God, were insincere in their worship, and failed to trust God in national affairs. He wanted them to repent, turn away from idol worship, mend their ways, and be faithful to God. And this was the last chance God was giving the people to change their lives. God was waiting and willing to forgive them, and he wanted to restore their relationship, but it was up to them. Well, Jeremiah was called to be a prophet, not a politician. The language he used is plain, tough, and not very polite. And it certainly wouldn't pass the political correctness of today. And it seemed that everything that could go wrong went wrong, and he was in the middle of it. But he prayed, preached, suffered, and kept on striving for over 40 years. And because of his role, he didn't participate in the ordinary joys and sorrows of his community, and he didn't marry. At times he had to battle his own inner doubts and conflicts, and had periods of despondency where he wished he'd never been born, or he could run away and live alone in the desert. However, he had periods of happiness when he could say to God, "Your words have become a joy to me and the delight of my heart." And he felt that God was also a warrior fighting alongside him. By nature, he was a sensitive, introspective person, probably shy, but he also proves himself to be a courageous and a persistent person. He was referred to as the weeping prophet because he was concerned about his countrymen's impending judgment and punishment. He agonised over the message he had to bring to the people. And he could also weep about the way he was treated. His family and neighbours turned against him, and his message was rejected. He often had to endure physical suffering from the hands of the people. He was poor and underwent severe deprivations. He was imprisoned, thrown into a cistern, and finally taken to Egypt against his will. And it's thought that he was probably killed there. So, what can we learn from the life of Jeremiah? Well, by our standards, it turns our ideas of success upside down. Success for us is achieving goals, good jobs, homes, and wealth. We'd like to be emotionally secure and have a calm life. We'd like people to like us and accept us and listen to what we have to say, especially our families. Well, did Jeremiah achieve fame, fortune, and a comfortable life? No. Was he always emotionally stable? No. Was he liked by his family, friends, and the people? No. Did the people listen to his message and turn back to God? No. Well, was Jeremiah a failure? No, definitely not in God's eyes. In fact, God must have regarded him as one of the most successful people around. Why? Because he was obedient, honest, faithful, courageous, compassionate, and yet he didn't compromise the message, and he didn't count the personal cost. I felt quite humbled by this man. I looked at my own life, and I thought, am I always obedient to God's call, or do I make excuses? Am I honest, faithful and courageous about my faith? Am I compassionate with the people who would disagree with me or their lifestyles? Or do I count the cost of being committed to God and only want to do things when everything's going my way? Am I willing to keep going when life, work, or things in the church get a bit rough? Do I listen to God's voice and do I do what he wants me to do? Or like Paul, like Jeremiah and Paul, will I fight the good fight and keep the faith and finish the race? And I think one of the qualities I most admire in Jeremiah is that he overcame fear. His was a tremendous step of faith in a dreadful situation. What he was being called to do was life-changing and life-threatening, and he was young and vulnerable. And some of the most famous people in the Bible have had to face their fears. Moses on the banks of the Red Sea, with the Egyptians bearing down on him and nowhere to run. David faced Goliath without protective armour and only a slingshot. Paul had to abandon his old secure beliefs and embrace a completely new life of grace. When called, they would have all experienced, like Jeremiah, the fear of the unknown, of the unexpected, of being misunderstood, of failure, and even death. They knew it was impossible to achieve their calling in their own strength. I don't think anyone is immune from fear. Fear is the number one problem most people face. And fear is destructive and paralysing. Fear holds us back in life, and it can stop us from doing God's will. And while our minds are gripped with fear, we can't function well.